In Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, the Apostle Paul dictates the phrase, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." And often when people reference that thought, they use that verse as though it's the entirety of the sentence, which it's not. Paul typically writes or talks in long sentences, so the sentence where that phrase is found starts back in verse 21, not verse 23. And the sentence does not end until the end of verse 26. Now, while you can make the case that the main point of what he is suggesting in that long sentence is that nobody's perfect, everybody has sinned, there's more to that sentence than just that statement. We've previously talked about the possible date for the writing of this epistle to the Christians in Rome. We even mentioned, I think briefly, that Paul is dictating it. There is a man by the name of Tertius who is writing it down as a scribe, and that's mentioned in the very last chapter of Romans. But as Paul is dictating this letter to these Christians that he has never yet met, he mentions in chapter 1 that he is a debtor to everyone. He recognizes what God has blessed, how God has blessed him and what God has blessed him with this message. He makes a statement in the next verse that he is ready to preach the gospel to those at Rome in verse 15. Verse 16 says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone." So he talks about some positives in those first 17 verses. And then starting in verse 18 of chapter 1, all the way up to chapter 3 and into chapter 3, he's dealing with this inconsistent culture. How do you deal with a culture that is irrational, illogical, focuses on emotion rather than fact? Paul had to deal with a culture such as that. So do we. What does he say? In chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, these are the words that you find. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divinity, so that they are without excuse." So there are things in the creation that point in the direction of God, and individuals that have failed to acknowledge that really have no excuse because they should have seen those things. What things? Maybe a good way to answer that question is let Scripture answer it for us. Because Paul previously has dealt with a group of philosophers in the country of Greece, in the city of Athens, who really do not understand how the creation shows the handiwork of God. They don't acknowledge it. Paul talks about it in Acts chapter 17. And here's what he says. "God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he has need of anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their appointed times, the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being." Now, to these philosophers, what has he stated? Well, he's talked about, number one, the creation, that God's made everything, so why do we think he needs to dwell in a physical building? If we really think about what he's done, he's beyond that. In verse 25, the characteristics of God are the fact that he doesn't need anything from us. He's beyond that as well. He's not worshipped with men's hands as though he needs anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. In verse number 26, the plan that he has for that creation, a plan that extends to every human being, no matter what culture, what nationality, no matter anything about their background, God considers all of them part of that creation and individuals that are recipients of those blessings. He's even determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of the habitation. There's a tremendous amount of planning in what God has actually done. And then down to verse 27, the course of humanity is that we need to be actually seeking the creator of heaven and earth, even though he is not very far from each one of us. Verse 27, there is a connection that can be possible with the God, the creator of heaven and earth. In verse 28, in him we live and move and have our being. There is a continuity, there's a continuation that we actually enjoy because of that connection with the one that created us. Now, when he's writing to the Christians in Rome, there's a similar understanding as far as the culture goes. Rome and those that have become Christians out of that Roman background grew up with a pantheon of gods and goddesses. They had gods and goddesses all over the place. That idea that he talks about to those Greek philosophers, you don't have to worship the God of heaven as though he needs something from you. He's provided everything for you. And here in verse 22 of Romans chapter 1, after talking about the fact that God really created everything, he says, these people professing to be wise became fools. And he's prefaced that with the statement we already read in verse 18, individuals who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And he says in verse 21, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So what's the problem? A kind of thinking that really doesn't make any kind of rational sense. Maybe it's a preconception that I'm basing my religion on that has no basis in any kind of fact I can find, no evidence in anything historical that I can base it upon. Down in verse 22, there's an arrogance. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Well, how did that arrogance evolve? Verse 23 and 24. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man, like birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Well, fashioned God into an idol. Well, if God created everything, including those images that we put together to try to picture what God looks like, that doesn't even make any sense. The very next verse, in verse 24, therefore God gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Focus on material things and get your mind off of spiritual things. Try to picture in a physical way who and what God would look like. Continuing that kind of process, though, with this arrogant kind of ignorance that existed in their culture and in ours. Verse 26 and following. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. Society where things that should be present that would build society up really don't. How long would a society exist if the accepted act of the day was not something that was heterosexual at all? Where would the next generation come from? The idea that is so seemingly predominant within our culture makes up less than 1% of our culture. And yet that less than 1% flaunts the idea as though it's something that is pervasive everywhere. But again, if that were the norm, humanity would cease to exist within a generation. It doesn't make any sense. Statements made in verse 28, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. And then he lists some very specific things. Being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. It's quite a list. But the most worrisome thing of all is not necessarily the list, but the very last statement that he makes in chapter 1. Who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. It's a society that applauds negative and destructive behavior. Situation ethics taken to its nth degree. You can't tell me what's right. You can tell me what's wrong. What's wrong for you may be right for me. I will do whatever I want because there is no such thing as absolute truth. Have you ever stopped to think that when people say there's no such thing as absolute truth, they're making an absolute statement, which means that their statement is a false statement? An inconsistent society. It has abounded in so many different generations. It abounded in that first century. You see it today. What happens? What else does Paul say about dealing with an inconsistent culture? That's another subject for another time. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.